I have so much to get through. I had to cut off a significant amount already this morning, so we need to get started. All right. So why did I choose this topic? The biggest reason was actually Elizabeth Beardsley. So if you are at all familiar with Ruthmere, Elizabeth was the lady of the house. She only had one child, and that was Ruth. That child was not had until after Albert and Elizabeth had been married for about 8 years. So I think it's easy to assume that Elizabeth probably had a very complicated journey trying to conceive and dealing with infertility. So I thought, because this was such a taboo topic at that time, it was really worth talking about. And it's something that needs to be brought to light so that we can have a better understanding of health today after seeing it in that context. I wanted to know perhaps what steps did she take to try to help with her infertility? What did her and Albert discuss? Did they know? Were they open with each other, or did he treat it as kind of like womanly problems, like it was kind of her thing? She's got to deal with it. I wanted to know, was she subject to the shame that doctors put on women, just blaming them for their own inability to conceive, or her emotional behavior before or after Ruth's birth and death? What did her privilege allow her that other people did not have? And unfortunately, we will never know the answer to these questions because none of that was kept. But we might be able to take some guesses after learning a little bit more about how other women were treated at that time. So, hysteria. It's not just a word for nuts, nor is it just a Def Leppard song. Some of you here earlier, I was playing Def Leppard as you came in. And as you can see, as a general rule, all women are hysterical, and every woman carries with her the seeds of hysteria. So what does hysteria mean? It actually derives from the Greek word for the womb. It's described in literature all the way dating back to ancient Egypt. The womb was once believed to have a mind of its own, capable of moving literally throughout the body, causing dangerous mental and physical ailments. Hippocrates was actually the first to use the term hysteria in the 5th century. And anything, mental or physical, wrong with a woman could be called hysteria. And a lot of it had to do with whatever was medically or culturally relevant at that time. And this is all the way up to right around the early 1900s, that it was considered to be a sound medical diagnosis. There is a litany of things that could fall beneath the umbrella of hysteria, from epilepsy, schizophrenia, OCD, postpartum depression, heart troubles, breathing troubles, liver complaints, muscle weakness, pregnancy complications, dizziness, weeping, laughing, absurd speech, choking, feigning, convulsions, contortions. This is just a small portion of the many things that went into that. And oftentimes, simply having a uterus meant that you were hysterical. And this permanently colored the way that women were treated in the medical world and allowed doctors to blame everything and anything on the womb or the supposed inferiority of the female design. So, it's not that humorous, early medical attitudes. Hippocrates, who lived in approximately 460 to 370 BCE, shaped the medical world drastically. He taught about 4 humors that made up the human body, which was blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And an imbalance of these humors caused illness. It was common medical knowledge that female bodies were phlegmatic, full or ruled by phlegm, and male bodies were sanguine or choleric, ruled by blood and bile. So with humorism, doctors basically believed that the cold, wet nature of the female made them prone to illness. He did emphasize that women needed to be dealt with differently than men, but did not promote women's right to bodily autonomy. And at this time, this is very important to note, human dissection was prohibited. So actual knowledge about anatomy was extremely limited. Hippocrates believed that the womb hungered for intercourse and pregnancy, and that an unfulfilled uterus could move around the body and cause, quote, suffocation of the womb, wreaking havoc on the organs that it reached. There was Arrhenius, the Greek physician of the 2nd century AD, who said the uterus was like an animal within an animal. It was able to move hither and thither and had appetites. Herbal fumigations were used to coax the uterus back into place. Foul-smelling herbs were put at the nose, and sweet-smelling herbs were put at the vagina to lower it back down. For a long time, women were experts on women and obstetrics, such as healers and midwives. But this changed greatly when Christianity was spread throughout Europe, and it brought the notion that women and their bodies were responsible for the sin in the world. So in the medieval era, which was a very religious era, doctors were forbidden from physically examining women due to Christian laws. And there was a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, by Heinrich Kramer, which was published in 1486, which was used to systematically murder thousands of women and shut out women from practicing healthcare due to the belief that the healers were witches. And then there was another book called On the Secrets of Women in the late 13th or early 14th century by a follower of Saint Albert the Great, and it was used to instruct churchmen in matters of fertility, conception, and pregnancy without getting their hands dirty. So this was aimed toward celibate monks and priests, and they had to know how to basically give penance to women who were, dealing with womanly problems. They claimed that menstruating women could poison the people around them with cancer and leprosy. And this understanding was needed so that priests would know how to give penance. I said that. The first work in English is considered to be a brief discourse of a disease called the suffocation of the mother by Edward Jordan. It was the first English text that actually addressed the female womb. And during antiquity, throughout the Middle Ages, dissection of human cadavers was forbidden on religious and cultural grounds, so no anatomical drawing of a woman was actually made until 1543. There was Thomas Willis, a physician who first coined the term neurology. He was the first to separate the womb from the brain, and this was in 1667. He performed an autopsy and found that a woman's uterus was in place, but she had died from complications of encephalitis, or inflammation of the brain, after childbirth. So eventually they did start making that, taking the womb from the brain, but the downside of this was that hysteria now had a much wider definition, and it wasn't just stuff that had to do with your reproduction or sexual functions. So in the 1800s, gynecology arose as its own medical field, and midwives had to give over the reins to men. Women now had no say or input at the moment their field was beginning to advance dramatically. So there was a medical and scientific consensus that women had evolved to be dumber, weaker, and more fragile, and that hysteria was a function of this evolutionary inferiority. It was, they argued, evidenced in the bones of women themselves. The study of anatomy depicted men's bones with medical knowledge about the body and women's with aesthetic, cultural, or societal concerns. The first drawing you see is the first anatomical drawings of a woman's body that I mentioned from 1543. Then in 1796, German anatomist Samuel Thomas von Sommering illustrated the female skeleton with a tiny head, a broad pelvis, and narrow rib cage, as did Marie Genevieve Charlotte Dalou-Thiroux d'Auconville. I have no idea if I pronounced that right. The French had 80 names, usually. She did 1759 drawings of the female skeleton much the same way, really narrow rib cage. They always gave us a tiny head, which I have a huge head, so that's obviously not the case. John Barclay in 1828 illustrated the same exaggerations and included a horse with the man and an ostrich with the woman. I get the horse, I don't get the ostrich, I'm just saying. And all psychologists, this is a quote from Gustave Le Bon in 1879, an anthropologist. All psychologists who have studied the intelligence of women, as well as poets and novelists, recognize today that they represent the most inferior forms of human evolution, and that they are closer to children and savages than to an adult civilized man. He concluded that distinguished, intelligent women were, as the birth of any monstrosity, as, for example, a gorilla with two heads. So that gives you a good idea of how people felt. Craniology and phrenology led to the belief that women's skulls were, smaller, and therefore that women had smaller brains, were less intelligent. There was a Parisian anthropologist by the name of Paul Broca who believed that the study of women was crucial to prevent women's rights reformers from upsetting the natural order of things. They needed scientific proof that women were inferior. So, doctors also could not be expected to cure women's ailments if they were a product of evolution. Their ailments were just part of the natural feminine condition. And then there was James Crichton Browne, who was a Darwinist, he believed that Darwin's theories proved that women were inferior and therefore more susceptible to insanity, hysteria, and diseases of the mind. He, in 1860s, concluded that female brains were smaller, that women's suffrage would cause injuries to women's taxed bodies and diminished minds, and her mind and body would collapse under its own rebellious weight. Yeah. So, obviously, white women were, very much in the bad side of things, but even more so, this was worse for black women. There was a belief that upper-class women, or white women, could tolerate less pain than lower-class women, especially black women. Gunning S. Bedford's 1856 clinical lectures on the diseases of women and children says that illnesses were not equal to all women. Lower classes enjoyed immunity to special diseases, and women's illnesses were the province chiefly of the upper class. Most of the 19th century medicine was explicitly racist, and this was especially true when it came to women's specific health issues. Black women were believed to mature sexually earlier, and it was believed that physical labor was beneficial to blacks and that slavery was the ideal condition for maintaining their health, even years after emancipation. So black women's illnesses were rarely written about, and physicians seemed to believe that black women's diseases were entirely different than whites. They received very little prenatal and natal care, especially. White, wealthy Western European women were most sensitive to pain. Quote, savage women's pains was all characterized by its sameness. They all felt and experienced exactly the same thing, according to doctors. There was also racism embedded in the perception of the appearance of a woman's genitalia, a distinct avenue for colonial exploitation. So the image you see here is an illustration of a woman named Sarah Bartman, who lived from 1789 to 1815. She was a freak show attraction brought to England by the surgeon Alexander Dunlop, who paraded her around to show off her unusually shaped body and genitals. Wealthy families were allowed to touch her. She was marketed as the Hottentot Venus. She died at the age of 26, after which her remains were put on display at a museum in Paris, along with a wax mold of her labia. She wasn't actually buried in her homeland until 2002. So white women were also encouraged not to use birth control so that they could keep up with the birthing rates of blacks and immigrants. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So, I love this quote from James Marion Sims, the father of gynecology. If there's anything that I hated, it was investigating the organs of the female pelvis. Glad he's the one that's on the job. One of the most controversial figures in the advancement of women's medicine is Sims, who is sometimes called the father of gynecology. He's credited with curing some of the supposedly incurable health issues that women had during the 1800s, but his legacy largely came about due to racist beliefs and the exploitation of enslaved women. He set up a practice in 1840 in Montgomery, Alabama, where enslaved people made up nearly 2/3 of the population. They were the majority of his patients, and he treated them in a makeshift hospital in his yard. Sims actually admitted to being disgusted by women's bodies and their reproductive organs, but despite this, continually worked on them. He experimented on several enslaved women, some of which were Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha, and we don't know if they had last names or anything beyond that. No first-person account exists of their perspectives or what they went through. Since he believed that black women felt less pain, he felt justified in experimenting on them and paid their owners for their use. Anarcha endured 30 surgeries at the hands of Sims, and I'll talk a little bit more on why that was later. So we have to keep in mind that so many of the medical advancements at this time came about because people, especially African Americans, were exploited. So. Oh, I'm sorry. So that was a statue of Sims. I don't remember where it was, but very recently it was actually taken down because of that, very complicated legacy he had. So, 19th century psychiatrists were fixated on Shakespeare's Ophelia from Hamlet as a case study in hysteria, particularly as brought on by a sexually active youth. Her descent into madness was symbolized by her hair, and soon this became to be a medically relevant appearance to hysterical patients. The more a woman's hair was undone, the more hysterical she was. Hysterical symptoms were so diverse that doctors often debated on the cause, but often certain physical ailments such as epilepsy, chronic pain, and vaginismus were said to be caused by hysteria. In other words, anxiety and depression, or things like that, caused illness rather than illnesses causing anxiety and depression. In the first half of the 19th century, all women's hysterical symptoms were linked to the womb. And since doctors' views were so varied, some symptoms of hysteria were treated different over the century. So epilepsy, being one, was already a highly stigmatized disease that was seen as feminine, incurable, and a form of hysteria. Often women who suffered from epilepsy spent their entire life in an asylum. Chronic pain was either dismissed as hysteria, either insinuating that the woman with chronic pain was lying, or that her nerves were causing her pain. A 19th century doctor by the name of John Rutter in Liverpool, for instance, did an autopsy on a friend of his after she died at her request to find the source of a chronic pain that she'd lived with after a miscarriage. Despite finding several cysts, tumors, and other ailments within her body, he believed that her intense emotions following the miscarriage caused her pain. Vaginismus is a condition characterized by the involuntary or spasmic tightening of the vagina during intercourse, resulting in pain, and this was often dismissed as a symptom of hysteria. Doctors who did try to help with this condition treated it as a couple's problem, not a woman's problem. Sims, the doctor I mentioned earlier, he's actually the first doctor to give a name to this condition, and he proposed a solution that involved removing the hymen. Sufferers of hysteria also often had sexual symptoms. Either they weren't interested in sex or they were nymphomaniacs who could not seem to get enough of it. The Victorians had a very strange fixation on nymphomania. Model women were not supposed to enjoy sex, but only partake in it for the sake of reproduction. And any woman who liked it was considered hysterical. This included masturbation, for which there were extremely drastic cures, which I will touch on later. Women who had anxiety about birth or who experienced any form of postpartum depression were hysterical, especially if they were cruel to their husbands or their children. So has anybody heard of the yellow wallpaper, the short story? Okay, we got a couple of people. So one suggested cure for hysteria was rest. Silas Weir Mitchell, an American physician, was an expert in neurology. He proposed that women who were hysterical should not be exposed to anything. They should be totally isolated, unable to read, engage in hobbies, talk to others, or even at times look outside. Depriving them of any creative outlet was supposed to dull their senses enough to tame them back into order. One of his patients was a woman by the name of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who is now famous for her 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, a woman's account in the story of her descent into madness during a rest cure prescribed by her husband. Gilman was not married to Mitchell in real life, but all the same, her story exposed the cure as a torturous experience made to drive women into further despair. The rest cure could last for up to months at a time. In the end, it was dismissed as poor treatment, and the yellow wallpaper is actually better known than the doctor who prescribed the treatment was. So, good for her. All right. Asylums and hospitals, museums of mad. Women of all social classes and ethnicities were admitted to mental asylums in the 1800s for a variety of reasons, many of which were simply going against social norms and expectations of men at that time. Cited reasons for institutionalizing women included depression, lacking a menstrual cycle, menstruating too heavily, menopause, novel reading, spiritualism, studying, religious excitement, domestic trouble, sunstroke, postpartum depression, being too interested in sex or not interested enough, or even as a pretense for men to pursue affairs without worrying about being discovered. Insane asylums often abused patients. In 1857, Charles Dickens, who actually had a more progressive view on insanity in asylums, published an article called The Star of Bethlehem, which was an historical account of Bethlehem Hospital in London, which is also referred to as Bethlehem or Bedlam. And that was founded in 1247 and became a psychiatric hospital for the insane in the 1300s. He recounted the decay of the walls, the brutality of the physicians, and the discrimination and abuse used on the tenants. Insane people were chained and even flogged before social reforms in England. An American institution of note was the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell Island in New York, now called Roosevelt Island. Nellie Bly was an investigative journalist. She published a report of her time called 10 Days in a Madhouse in 1887. The asylum was overcrowded, and Bly was subject to cold baths, filthy living conditions, spoiled food, and physical abuse. So after her expose, the asylum closed 7 years later. And she actually changed the world of investigative journalism by doing that. The biggest culprit was probably, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, the Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, that originally began as a refuge for women who were learning disabled, mentally ill, epileptic, or poor. But under the guidance of Jean-Martin Charcot in the 1870s, it became a neuropsychiatric training facility or teaching facility. However, it was more a circus than a hospital, and Charcot was more of a ringleader than a doctor. So this image right here is of Charcot. That's his actual portrait. And this is pictures of a woman that was actually in that asylum who they were asking to perform various different types of hysteria. Charcot paraded women like Louise Augustine Gleizes, or Augustine, around in front of fascinated crowds to demonstrate the scope of their hysterical symptoms and treatments for relieving them, which were sometimes violent. He recommended treating hysteric patients by applying pressure to parts of the body he called the hysterogenic zones, which translated to punching women in the ovaries. Many physicians came to see his demonstrations, including Sigmund Freud, but anyone who was anybody could come and gawk at the insane like they were animals in a zoo. In fact, Augustine, when she was a child, was raped, and her rapist was invited to come watch a demonstration. Yes. Patients were coached to behave in stereotypically crazy ways. Guests were allowed to gawk at Augustine, poke her, pull her hair, prick her skin. They hypnotized her, shoved needles through the skin between her fingers. They forced her to eat charcoal and told her it was chocolate. Charcot was never condemned for the cruelty directed at his patients, nor the exploitation of their mental illnesses. In fact, Charcot is still celebrated as a groundbreaking researcher of hysteria and other neurological things, such as Parkinson's, I believe. So very similar to Sims, none of the dark things he did during his time were considered bad. So, all right, speculating about the speculum. Speaking of Sims, let's talk about an invention that he is often credited with, which is the vaginal speculum in its modern form. Sims and also a midwife inventor and obstetrics writer, Marie Boivin, were both credited with the creation of the modern speculum. Sims' surgeries that he performed on enslaved women led to this creation in the 1840s for him. However, Marie's speculum was invented to treat disorders of the cervix in 1825, which is the duckbill version that we commonly see today. So this was his. I've never seen anybody use that personally. It looks more painful to me. But yeah, so obviously Sims was given much more credit for inventing the speculum because he was a man. So, but the use of this was very hotly debated. Some doctors believed that it could induce hysteria, such as Marshall Hall, who was an English physician, 1850, argued that the speculum poisoned the female mind and disturbed the modesty of female patients and made women erotically hysteric. Robert Lee, professor of midwifery at the St. George's Hospital in London, thought the speculum was useless and dangerous and that it risked breaking the hymen and taking a woman's virginity. Robert Brudenell Carter, British surgeon, believed that any attention a woman paid to her own reproductive organs and genitals could lead to consequences for her physical and moral health. The speculum drew undue attention to that area. And others believed the speculum would stimulate a woman's vulva, vagina, or cervix and unleash a torrent of uncontrollable sexual urges. Those who were pro-speculum still believed that women were not to be trusted with their own descriptions of their symptoms, and this actually allowed doctors to have more power over women because they could see parts of their body that they could not see themselves. And always the end goal was to make women have babies, of course. And then unfortunately, a lot of times the speculum was used forcibly on women, especially sex workers in England and France, as a means of disease control. Women who did not obey the constraints of virtuous Victorian femininity were subject to inspection by the government to check for venereal diseases. The Contagious Diseases Act in 1864 in England allowed moral policemen to register all women who were prostitutes and force them to endure humiliating and painful inspections with the speculum. In France, women often refer to it as the government's penis. So, okay. So, brace yourself. I'm about to use words one doesn't normally hear in polite conversation. So due to the long history of women's anatomy being unknown due to constraining laws about dissecting cadavers, the clitoris remained shrouded in mystery. In fact, the clitoris was first, quote, discovered in the 16th century with Professor Matteo Realdo Colombo and an anatomist, Gabriele Falloppio, of the fallopian tubes, arguing about which one of them discovered it first. Yeah. One of the first mentions of it was in the Hammer of Witches, which referred to it as the devil's teat, and claimed that any woman who had one could be assumed to be a witch. Then it wasn't mentioned again until 1672, when a Dutch anatomist was the first to publish a detailed diagram of the internal and external structure of it. And then again, not again until 1844, when the physician George Ludwig Kobelt deemed it a sexual organ, but all of his peers basically called him crazy and said it's not an organ used for pleasure, it is the root of all hysteria. So unfortunately, the mutilation of women was all too common as a cure for hysteria. Clitoridectomies, dated back to the Roman era, used as a way to control women and their sexuality, but Victorians renewed the interest in them, and many doctors advocated for them as cures for hysteria. Doctors such as Isaac Baker Brown and Charles Edward Brown Sequard advocated clitoridectomies to prevent women from masturbating, which they believed led to melancholia, paralysis, blindness, and death. Brown established the London Surgical Home for the reception, this is a long one. The London Surgical Home for the reception of gentlewomen and females of respectability suffering from curable surgical diseases. Yes, in the 1850s, and in 1866 published a book called On the Curability of Certain Forms of Insanity, Epilepsy, Catalepsy, and Hysteria in Females, which defined hysteria with an array of symptoms that all centered on the clitoris. His book was full of case studies of women who were suffering from things today like endometriosis or multiple sclerosis, among other things, and all the women in his case studies, he claimed, improved after the procedure. And then there was also Robert Tuttle Morris, an American surgeon who pioneered the technique of ovarian grafting, which actually helped women suffering with infertility. And then there was Robert Batty, a gynecologist and former Civil War surgeon who was a pioneer of the ovariotomy, claimed that removing the ovaries cured a litany of ailments and symptoms of hysteria. He was inspired by another surgeon who actually used the procedure to help with life-threatening tumors and cysts, but Batty took it a very apt name, I would say, took it a step further, and he believed its benefits went beyond the life savings, and despite the fact that the other surgeon warned him that they shouldn't be used for unsuitable cases. So in the 1880s, women were very crazy about this surgery. They heard that it made you healthy and comfortable, and unfortunately, a lot of them died because they got this surgery to just remove their ovaries for no reason. So, all right, childbirth. In the words of Queen Victoria, was a complete violence to all one's feelings of propriety. Childbirth is and was a violent situation. There was no way around it. Women knew it. In fact, many Victorian women spent 9 months of gestation preparing for the possibility of death. And if they weren't killed, they still knew there was a distinct possibility that they could be maimed for life. Women who survived childbirth faced lacerations, tears in the perineal tissues, fistulas, prolapsed uteruses, and tears in their vaginal walls or cervix. Many of these issues, especially in the first half of the century, were deemed incurable. Victorian women gave birth at home, and that was not just a luxury for the wealthy. Everybody did that. At the beginning of the century, they were accompanied by midwives, but towards the end, of course, the doctors took over, pushed the midwives out. Of course, women gave birth without the use of any painkillers for most of the first half of the century, actually most of the century. And many doctors actually preferred it to stay that way, such as Charles Meeks, who was a professor of obstetrics and diseases of women at the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. He thought that pain was given by God to help mothers love their babies, and that women only needed the cheering counsel of male obstetricians to guide them. He also believed that women only actually endured 25 minutes of pain during childbirth. The first major form of anesthesia for childbirth was chloroform, which was popularized by Queen Victoria herself. There's a picture of her with a couple of her babies, although this was pretty early. She did not have chloroform for those. She hated pregnancy. She called it the, quote, shadow side of marriage, and elected to use chloroform for the birth of her 8th child. So this was still only available to middle and upper class women, and childbirth remained painful and agonizing for poor women who were forced to give birth and lying in hospitals or workhouses. And then I found another device. This is called a pessary. They have modern versions of these, but this is a Victorian version. This is used to help a collapsed or prolapsed uterus. So this is a piece of metal they would shove up in there. It looks pretty intimidating. All right. Obscene literature. Birth control and abortion had been happening for centuries, but the 19th century saw a dramatic increase in concern among the ministry and medical professions surrounding both. In 1873, the Comstock Laws, a set of federal acts prohibiting the trade, circulation, and distribution of obscene literature and articles of immoral use, made circulating materials about birth control and abortifacients a federal offense. Nonetheless, there was an increase in the use of birth control in the latter half of the century, perhaps due to the need of an increasingly urban and industrialized society to limit the number of children and provide security, education, and inheritance to the ones that the parents already had. The birth rate decreased, but only among white women. African American immigrants were still having children in large amounts, which led to anti-birth control sentiments fueled by racism and xenophobia, who believed that these groups should not dominate the population. By 1900, white women only averaged about 3.56 children, which they started the century with 7. But physicians, of course, warned against birth control, condoms, and diaphragms, citing them as sources of mental illness, nervous tension, cancer, and other ills. And these were, of course, beginning seeds for movements that would continue and grow later in the 20th century. But a couple of things we have here. I really love this image right here. It says, "And the villain still pursues her." It's great. These pills, they're called pennyroyal pills. Pennyroyal is a very toxic plant, and women would take these pills to, it was basically a morning after pill. And often it would kill the woman who took them. So these are also different birth control pills. See the name there, Pierce? Anybody been to Doc Pierce's before? I'll talk about that later a bit more. And then this is a condom or a sheath. It doesn't look very comfortable, does it? All right. So, as the realm of women's health increasingly went to men, women became less prepared to tell their daughters how to prepare for menarche, which is the beginning of the period. I did not know that. Did anybody hear that word before? Okay, some people have. I had never heard it, and I was like, oh, a new thing I learned about myself. Great. Yeah. I thought it was menarche, but nope, it's menarche. Women did not want to talk to their daughters about periods because of the Victorian belief that alluding to sexuality in any way would steal a girl's innocence and cause her to have sexual feelings she would not otherwise have. Unfortunately, women were equally as ashamed to bring up topics of menstruation with their doctors, who would never ask, of course. Indeed, having your period was taboo despite the fact that it happened to half of the population. Doctors found it easy to blame mothers for not teaching their daughters enough about menstruation. This led to reliance on health and hygiene guides for domestic use, replacing the conversations that women used to have organically within their household about what was happening with their bodies. And how do women deal with their periods in the 1800s? Most women made something absorbent, perhaps out of cotton, gauze, or cheesecloth, and they assembled their own reusable pads that they washed after use. Mass-produced napkins were not available until the 1890s, but even then, not a lot of people used them. With the advent of germ theory, though, women became increasingly aware of the disease and contamination that could be spread by their menses, which eventually led to more use of disposable pads rather than the reusable ones. and it was widely understood and accepted that menstruation affected a woman's mind and ability to reason. So with that, when we look at this quote is from Henry Maudsley in Popular Science Monthly, June 1874. When we look at the matter honestly in the face, it would seem plain that women are marked out by nature for very different offices in life from those of men, and that the healthy performance of her special functions renders it improbable she will succeed and unwise for her to persevere in running over the same course at the same pace with him. So, men were adamant that women could not be educated or professionals, mostly due to their periods. Physicians like Edward Hammond Clark argued that women should not pursue college education, believing that it would make them ill, mad, or infertile. He thought that women could literally study to death. The main advocates for women's education were, of course, women, such as Julia Ward Howe and Mary Putnam Jacobi. Julia Ward Howe was a suffragist. She compiled a book of essays called Sex and Education, a reply to E.H. Clarke's Sex and Education, which he was the doctor I mentioned earlier. This book was actually consulted professors at colleges and proved that menstrual ill health was actually incredibly scarce, and women's health in general improved when they were allowed to study. And Mary Putnam Jacobi was actually a physician, scientist, and medical teacher. She submitted an essay to Harvard for the Boylston Medical Prize, addressing the question about whether or not women were required mental or bodily rest during menstruation. Her research found that the female brain did not, in fact, become defective during menstruation, and she became the first female to actually win that prize. And Jacobi herself was the doctor who eventually helped Charlotte Perkins Gilliam, who wrote the Yellow Wall paper. When she went to her, she actually gave her a treatment that was the total opposite of rest and isolation, which was basically stimulating the senses with intelligent and creative activity. So, who knew, right? All right. Breast cancer is one of the most commonly occurring forms of cancer, and that was even the case in the Victorian era and before. For centuries, doctors have debated the origins of it. Humorists believe that it was caused by the end of menstruation and an imbalance caused by ceased blood flow from the body. Some doctors cited childlessness and even nerves. For instance, in 1815, Scottish surgeon John Rodman argued that the female structure of the female constitution encouraged the development of breast cancer. And he even claimed to have treated a woman who developed it after a man's elbow brushed her on the breast. Two very valuable accounts of breast cancer surgeries which were performed without the use of anesthetics are that of Frances Fanny Burney, an English writer in 1812. I believe I put a picture. Yeah, that's her right there. And a woman named Susan Dillwyn Emlyn in 1815. So Burney describes doctors placing a handkerchief over her face so that she cannot see what's happening, and then the doctor plunging into her breast, cutting through veins, arteries, flesh, and nerves, while she screamed relentlessly through the whole thing. When the wound was made and the instrument was withdrawn, the pain seemed undiminished, for the air that suddenly rushed into those delicate parts felt like a mass of minute but sharp and forked poniards, I don't know how to say that, but that were tearing at the edges of the wound. And in Susan Dillwyn Emlyn's account, she described the attempted treatments beforehand, which she was confined to bed, forced to eat low diets, and then she was also bled with a lancet and leeches. When nothing helped, her doctor decided to perform the mastectomy. She said, "My suffering was severe beyond expression. My whole being seemed absorbed in pain. The tumor was taken out in 25 minutes, but it was an hour before I was in bed, where I lay for 14 hours before I finally became easy enough to sleep." We have no way of knowing how much of her breast was actually removed, nor if they succeeded in eradicating the cancer. The only painkiller that women would have been given was laudanum, which was a tincture of opium at that time, and it would have been after the fact, most likely. Before this procedure, the arms would be tied up and back, placing a stick between them and the body, which makes dissection easier and prevents the patient from disrupting the procedure. So later surgeries would have been performed with chloroform, much like birth, but it's kind of hard to see, but there is a woman here. She's got that stick. Her arm is up. It's definitely not hard definitely can't see it, but there's blood all over this room, which is pretty unfortunate. And then this is kind of an actual surgical diagram of how they would cut that open and then stitch it up after the fact. So going through that conscious is unbelievable. So there were 2 conditions that were thought to actually make women more beautiful, and women wanted to have them, causing them to be heavily romanticized, such as chlorosis, which is best understood now as an iron deficiency anemia, and tuberculosis. Chlorosis was often referred to as the virgin's disease. It was noted that the disease seemed to be found mostly in noble and beautiful young girls. Women with the disease were once prescribed bloodletting, which included marriage copulation, which was a cure for chlorosis. The medical literature of the time referred to it as the anemia of good-looking girls, and adolescent girls were expected to develop it. If they didn't, they wanted to, and it was an indicator of purity and beauty. They were told not to eat red meat, which is ironically the one thing that might have actually helped. But women were not supposed to eat meat. It was seen as a depraved and unladylike desire for flesh. Tuberculosis was another one, but its romanticization, you get what I'm trying to say, was even more out of left field. The realities of tuberculosis were actually quite grim and dirty. It had a reputation for enhancing the beauty of the women afflicted and was referred to in literature often a disease of beautiful, angelic women. Its appearance did align with beauty standards of the time, which was pale, emaciated, with a natural blush in the lips and cheeks. At its peak, tuberculosis killed off roughly 1/4 of the entire population of Europe. So, since tuberculosis often killed those who got it, there was another added layer of angelic sentiments, i.e. women who died young from tuberculosis died before they could lose their innocence. The advent of germ theory made this fashionable mystery of tuberculosis, it ruined the illusion, basically, which it was once a mark of sophistication, sensitivity, and beauty. Now it was a mark of uncleanliness. So, scapegoats for contagion. For centuries, women have been scapegoats for contagion, including in the Black Plague, which was heavily blamed on women. Before germ theory, the common wisdom was that bad air caused disease, and disease was associated with foul smells. In 1847, a physician named Ignaz Semmelweis, a physician at the Vienna General Hospital, was trying to figure out why women were dying at alarming rates from puerperal fever, which was a type of sepsis that happened after childbirth. He discovered that doctors who were delivering the babies were going from dissecting cadavers in the morgue to helping in the maternity ward without washing their hands. Yes. Semmelweis proposed a solution, doctors washing their hands with a chlorine solution. Since this was before germ theory, it actually was because chlorine had the strongest ability to get rid of the smell of death on their hands, and also was best at cleaning off the particular matter of the corpses. Although this worked, doctors everywhere were offended by that idea. How could it be their fault and not the fault of the women who were dying? Semmelweis's methods were ultimately abandoned until the advent of germ theory. He was dismissed as crazy, and I believe he actually ended up in an asylum. So, yes. So, doctors also blamed women's clothing for spreading bacteria when germs were discovered. And then, although this was not in the 1800s, I really want to mention this because it's such a great illustration of how women were treated as contagions. Typhoid Mary was a real person. Her name was Mary Mallon. Although she came over to the United States in 1884 at the age of 15 and brought with her typhoid fever, that she was not a presenter of symptoms, so she did not know she had it. She was discovered to be a carrier and was imprisoned at the North Brother Island off the coast of Manhattan, quarantined for the rest of her life. She was not the most infectious typhoid carrier of the era. The person who infected the most people was a man. But because she was an immigrant, Irish, and a woman without a family, she was demonized for the disease, and she was the only person to be locked up for it. So, I did not know Typhoid Mary was a real person before this, so. All right, I'm getting near the end here. Bear with me. All right. The concept of feminine and masculine foods is not new to us. Diets were divided by the sexes, and the new field of gastroenterology declared that women's diets should be restrictive, both in quantity and quality. If you could restrain yourself from food, especially flavorful food, you could be equally chaste in matters of sex. Doctors believed that women's stomachs were more prone to irritation due to how much space the womb took up. One figure in particular believed that women would be more prone to masturbation, which led to epilepsy, warts, acne, and other forms of hysteria if they ate flavorful foods. You might have heard of Kellogg's cereal. Thankfully, the not crazy brother is the one that made the good cereal. The crazy one was John Harvey Kellogg. I could go on a whole talk on its own about this guy. Yeah, he was nuts. He ran the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. He was obsessed with gut health, promoting flavorless and vegetarian diets. He created the first diet foods, which included the first iteration of bran flakes and corn flakes that absolutely do not resemble their modern iteration because they were completely flavorless. And then actually another example on a tangent is graham crackers. They were originally made as diet foods, did not taste or look at all like they do now. So Kellogg, among other things, he performed like yogurt enemas on women, like coffee enemas. Yeah, he had problems. Constipation at this time was more prevalent in women, and Kellogg believed it would lead to poisoning of the bloodstream. Doctors blamed women for constipation. For instance, Richard Epps, a London physician, wrote that women riding in carriages, going to parties, neglecting exercise, and relucting to seek help for constipation made it their fault. Samuel Donaldson, 1885, he wrote something that described constipated women as privileged, lazy, negligent, and shamed them for using laxatives. What do you want them to do, right? Some doctors went so far as to perform colectomies for the intervention of constipation, but most people did not survive this procedure. Surprise, surprise, you need your colon. And then there was Dr. R.V. Pierce. Yes, the same doctor that Doc Pierce's restaurant is named after. Advertised cures for women's gut issues and constipation, appealing to women by telling them that they knew better than their doctors did, which was sometimes, unfortunately, the case. So his advertisements were everywhere, often on the sides of buildings, which is how Doc Pierce's got their name, because there was a big advertisement they found on the side. He was from Cincinnati, Ohio. So yeah, just relatively close. Pierce did not dismiss women's complaints about their health and appealed to their desire for beauty. A well-oiled digestive system made you beautiful, was his argument. So this is a much later advertisement, obviously, in the 1900s, but the girl that men admire is basically a healthy woman. So he made all sorts of stuff. There's the vaginal tablets here, too. So he was very much into promoting women's health. Actually, he wasn't even really a doctor. He went to what was called like the Eclectic Medical Institute of Cincinnati, which was like an experimental alternative medicine school. So, all right. The history of women's urologic medicine is non-existent. It was assumed for the most part that women's bladder issues could not be solved. And this can be partially attributed to the humorous notion that women are simply leaky creatures. Victorian women were afraid to talk about urinary issues even with one another. One such complication was the fistula, a passageway in the body that connects two structures that are not normally connected. And this commonly occurred after infections from childbirth. Women would become incontinent from these and were often condemned to spend the rest of their lives isolated and smelling of urine. This was the affliction of Anarcha, the enslaved woman who J.D. Sims experimented on. He was an outlier. Most physicians did not take an interest in the female urinary system, but after 30 surgeries, Sims was able to close the abscess in her vagina, and it was rationalized and justified by the fact that she was facing a life without dignity and happiness from that condition. So they're like, oh, it's fine. He helped her. He gave her 30 surgeries, and in the end, she got to live her life. But we don't know if she had any say in that whatsoever. And he did actually continue to perform these surgeries without anesthesia, by the way, on all women, including white women, And he explained that that the procedure was not painful enough for the trouble of using anesthesia. Those who did take an interest in women's urinary health often said that the issues were psychosomatic or sexual, the product of hysteria, and often brought about by masturbation. So, all right. This is the last big section. So I'm hurrying along here. Okay, crap. I didn't know what time it was, sorry. So they thought women's bones were fragile and that it was their fault. Scoliosis was thought to be brought about for masturbation, go figure. Women were blamed for wearing corsets. In truth, most women did not and could not lace their corsets tightly enough to cause skeletal deformities, as it would impede their ability to clean, cook, play with children, or work. So really only upper class women who did nothing were in danger of having such tight corsets that it constricted their ribcage. Let's see. Cardiac medicine was considered to be a male-specific issue. Women's heart issues were written off as, of course, hysteria, emotional imbalance. The first American Heart Association conference for women did not happen until 1964, and even then, it was about their husbands. So it was on hearts and husbands was the subject. Women did partake in some sports and physical activities, especially towards the end of the century, but were discouraged from doing so, especially cycling. And I probably don't have time to really get into all of the details here, but basically they warned that women could suffer utter collapse, exhaustion, nervousness, anxiety, goiters, internal inflammation, chronic dysentery, and infertility from cycling. They also thought that women were using cycling to masturbate. So this, along with the belief that women were afflicted with an ugly condition called bicycle face, were two of the more absurd assumptions about cycling. And doctors believed it would inevitably lead to hysteria, of course. And then the Olympics. The founder of the Olympics said that women were not cut out for competing, but they first competed in 1900 in the fields of tennis, sailing, croquet, equestrianism, and golf. And the last thing, although doctors were beginning to abandon the diagnosis of hysteria by the late 1800s, it would forever change women's health and medicine. Even today, we are still grappling with doctors who believe we are exaggerating our ailments or blaming us for things that are out of our control. We're still eating feminized foods and obsessed with health's correlation to beauty. We are still benefiting from medical advancements that came about due to the exploitation of enslaved women. Women are still being excluded from offices due to being seen as overly emotional, and our anger and defiance is dismissed as PMS. Many are still of the belief that women are less intelligent, weaker, or more prone to mental breakdowns. Many are still of the belief that women's biological destiny should keep them out of the workforce and away from the polls. Many still believe that women are controlled by their wombs. Even though the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders has not listed hysteria since 1980, we are still feeling its influence in cultural, medical, and social settings, and that is why it is so incredibly important to see how far and yet how short of a distance we have come. And I'll let you read that quote for yourself.
Who is Charlie Kirk?
He is a political activist.
And not the Charlie Kirk who is one of our donors.
Oh!
Just want to make
Oops!
that really clear.
I didn't even think about that, I'm sorry.
The directors think about things like
Of course. I'm sorry that went on so long. Like I said, I even cut it back. So, I had to talk faster at the end.